Have you ever seen a whole town turn on one person? Well, they did just that to Evelyn Hale. They dragged her through the dirt by her hair, calling her worthless while everyone just watched. But when two little girls stepped up and said, "She's coming with us," that's when everything changed. This is a story about how kindness from a stranger can save a life. This is a story about second chances, about how the people who save us are sometimes the ones we least expect, and about finding family in the most broken moments of our lives. If you've ever felt thrown away by the world, this one's for you. Stick with me to see what happens, and if you like what you hear, hit that like button and tell me what city you're listening from. The dust puffed up around Evelyn's knees as she was pulled down the main street of Saddle Ridge. Margaret Crenshaw had a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back so hard she saw stars. The pain was just another part of her day. "This is what happens to thieves," Margaret shouted for the whole town to hear. But Evelyn didn't fight. There was no strength left for that. Her hands were limp, her body just a puppet on a string. The stale bread she had taken from the bakery's trash pile was long gone, stomped into the dirt, worthless just like they said she was. The August sun in Wyoming territory was just plain cruel. Evelyn's tattered dress was stuck to her back with sweat. The whole thing was a collection of patches and holes. She'd lost her shoes weeks ago, trading them for a single night's shelter in a barn. From the boardwalk, a man muttered, "Look at her, not even ashamed." But shame was a luxury she couldn't afford. 3 years had passed since her husband Daniel died. 3 years since the bank took their farm and she started this slow fall to nothing. At first, she tried to keep her head up, believing hard work would be enough. She was wrong. This town didn't care about dignity if you had no money, and it didn't care about character if you couldn't pay your dues at the church. Margaret jerked her forward again, and Evelyn's knees gave out. She fell, catching herself on her hands, the sharp rocks digging into her palms. The crowd was bigger now. Men on their way to the saloon, women out shopping, all stopping to watch. She knew their faces. Mrs. Patterson, who used to buy her eggs. Mr. Thornton, who spoke at Daniel's funeral. None of them said a word. "She was sleeping in my stable," shouted Henry Morrison. "Stole 2 blankets when she left." "I caught her in my trash last week," another voice added. The lies and half-truths piled on top of her. The blankets had been moldy discards. The trash was just that, trash. But the town needed someone to blame for their own hard times. Margaret hauled her to her feet, and Evelyn swayed, blood trickling from her scalp. She hadn't eaten in 3 days, and the world was starting to go dark at the edges. "So what should we do with her?" Margaret asked the crowd, playing her part. "We can't have her living like an animal, stealing from decent folk. She's coming with us." The voice was young, clear, and cut right through the noise. The street went dead quiet. Evelyn forced her head up, the pain shooting through her skull. And there, in the middle of the road, stood 2 little girls. They looked no older than 8 or 9, with braided hair and dirt on their cheeks. They held hands, a tiny, stubborn wall between Evelyn and the angry mob. "Layla, Maggie, you get back here," Margaret snapped, tightening her grip on Evelyn's hair. "This is not your business." "Yes, it is," the taller one, Layla, said. Her chin was stuck out, full of a courage that adults had long forgotten. "You're hurting her." "She's a thief," Margaret spat back. "She needs to learn a lesson." "You were throwing that bread away," Maggie piped up, her voice softer but just as steady. "Our teacher says it isn't stealing if no one wants it anymore." A few people in the crowd shifted on their feet. The little girl had a point. "That's not it," Margaret said, her face turning red. "She's a vagrant, and she needs to be—" "She needs a meal and a safe place to sleep," Layla finished for her. "So she is coming with us." Evelyn just stared. Little girls didn't talk back to adults, especially not to the wife of the richest man in town. "Does your father know where you are?" Margaret's voice was sharp now. "Does Thomas Reed know his daughters are causing trouble?" "He's right there," Maggie said, and pointed. The crowd parted, and Evelyn saw him. A man about 40, lean and weathered from hard work. He wore a simple faded shirt and canvas pants. He walked forward until he stood right beside his girls. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight at Margaret Crenshaw. his gaze steady and quiet. "Let her go," he said. The words were plain and simple, but they carried the weight of a coming storm. It wasn't a request. It was a fact. Margaret's hand fell away from Evelyn's hair. "Now see here, Thomas. This woman is—" "I know who she is," he said, moving slightly to stand in front of Evelyn. "And I know my girls just invited her to our home. So unless you mean to tell me how to raise my children, I suggest you let her go." And just like that, the power shifted. Margaret Crenshaw had money, but Thomas Reed had something else entirely. Respect. He was the man you called when you needed real help. He didn't waste time on gossip or politics, but when he spoke, folks listened. Margaret finally released Evelyn with one last hateful shove. Thomas caught Evelyn's elbow, steadying her. His grip was firm but gentle, like he knew she was close to breaking. "You'll regret this, Thomas Reed," Margaret said, pulling her fine skirts away from the dirt. "That woman is nothing but trouble." "I'll keep that in mind," Thomas said in a tone that promised he'd forget it by sundown. Margaret stormed off, and the crowd, robbed of their show, began to melt away. Thomas ignored the few who stayed to stare. He looked down at Evelyn, and for the first time in years, she felt like a person again. Have you ever been so beaten down that a stranger's kindness felt like a miracle? That was Evelyn, hurt and hopeless, when a man named Thomas and his two little girls stepped in. This story is about how one small promise can change a life. So if you believe in second chances, you will want to hear this. Up close, Evelyn saw the man clearly. He had lines around his eyes from a life spent in the sun. His hands were calloused, and he smelled like leather and wood smoke. "Can you walk?" he asked. Evelyn could only manage a nod, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. "Pa, she is bleeding," his daughter Maggie said, her little face full of worry. "I see it," Thomas answered, taking more of her weight. "Layla, take the satchel. Maggie, you carry the rope. We are going home." The girls moved right away, used to being helpful. Thomas started walking, matching his pace to hers. Her feet left little red tracks in the dust. Evelyn felt like she was floating above herself, watching this quiet man and his children lead her away from the town square, away from all the hateful stares. They walked past the white church and the schoolhouse, which was closed for the summer. Soon, the neat houses with their painted fences disappeared. The town street turned into a dirt road, and civilization gave way to the wide-open country. Evelyn had been out this way before, to the rough edges of town where people with nothing sometimes hid. But Thomas kept walking right past those places. He followed the road as it curved along a creek, heading for a stand of cottonwood trees in the distance. "How much farther?" Layla asked. "Another mile," Thomas said. "Are you girls tired?" "No, sir," they said together, though Maggie was starting to struggle with the heavy rope. "I got it, Pa," she said with pure grit. "I am strong." A quiet pride was in his voice when he said, "That you are." They walked in silence for a while, with just the sound of their boots on the dirt and the wind in the grass. Evelyn's breathing became shallow, and she felt weak. "Almost there," Thomas said, and she was not sure who he was talking to. A cabin slowly came into view around a bend in the creek. It was small but solid, built from logs that had turned a silvery gray. Smoke drifted from the chimney. A big vegetable garden grew on one side with neat rows of beans and squash. It was a real home. It looked like a life Evelyn used to know, a life that now felt like somebody else's memory. Thomas helped her up the 3 worn porch steps and into the house. The inside was dim after the bright sun, and her eyes needed a moment to adjust. She saw one large room, with the space divided by use. A stove and a counter made up the kitchen area. A big table with benches was for eating. "Sit her down," Thomas said, nodding toward a chair. Evelyn's legs gave out, and she collapsed into it. The solid wood felt real beneath her hands. Maggie was already at the pump getting water. Layla pulled clean cloths from a drawer. knowing just what to do. Thomas walked to the stove and ladled something into a bowl. The rich smell of chicken broth hit Evelyn, and her stomach cramped with a sudden, painful hunger. He set the bowl in front of her with a spoon, then stepped back to give her space. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. "Slow," Thomas said quietly. "Too much too fast will make you sick." She nodded, though she wanted to eat it all at once. The first spoonful of broth tasted so good it almost made her cry. She forced herself to take small sips. While she ate, Layla used a damp cloth to gently clean the blood from her face and hands. Her touch was surprisingly tender. Then Maggie came and started washing the dirt from Evelyn's feet with the same care. Evelyn sat perfectly still and let them. It did not feel real. She kept waiting for the catch, for the price she would have to pay. Thomas pulled up a chair across from her. He did not stare or ask questions. He just sat there, giving her the space to exist without any demands. "When you are done eating," he said after a while, "the girls will show you where you can clean up. There is a small room behind the kitchen. You can stay there." Evelyn's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. She looked him right in the eyes, trying to find the trick. Men did not offer shelter to women like her for nothing. "Why?" The word was a rusty whisper. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "The girls made you a promise," he finally said. "I do not let my daughters break their promises." He glanced over at Layla and Maggie, who were still focused on her feet. "Besides, a place like this always has work that needs doing. It seems to me you could use the work, and we could use the help. That is a fair trade." He was offering her a way to earn her keep, a way to hold on to what little pride she had left. "I do not have anything," she said, needing him to understand. "I did not ask what you do not have," Thomas interrupted gently. "I asked if you can work." For 3 years she had been running and hiding, treated like nothing. And now this man cut through all of it with that one simple question. She was not sure if she could trust it, but the warm broth in her stomach and the solid chair beneath her were real. "I can work," she said, and she meant it. Thomas nodded once, as if that settled everything. "Good. Then that is what you will do." Layla looked up from her task. "Pa, she needs bandages on her feet. The cuts are deep." "Get the tin from the shelf," Thomas said. "The one with the salve." Maggie ran to get it, and Evelyn watched as these 2 small, serious children began to carefully mend her wounds. They were the strangers who saved her, an odd pair of little girls. Laya was tall and dark-haired, all angles and seriousness. Maggie was her opposite, softer and round with a head full of wild curls, but they moved like 2 parts of the same whole. Evelyn's voice was still a rasp. "How old are y'all?" "I am 9, Laya announced. "Maggie is 8. "Almost 9, Maggie added quietly. Thomas just looked at them. "They are good girls," he said. And in those 3 words, Evelyn heard a world of pride, love, and a deep, hidden sorrow. She wanted to ask about their mother, but knew she had no right. The questions would have to wait. "All done," Laya said, sitting back. Evelyn carefully flexed her feet. The salve was already working its magic on the burns. "Better, thank you. Come on, Maggie," Laya said, grabbing the basin. "Let's show her the room." The girls led Evelyn to a small door next to the stove. It opened to what was clearly a storage room, with crates and shelves full of preserves. But a narrow window let in the afternoon sun, and there was just enough space for a small bed. "We will get this cleared out tomorrow," Laya said, already making plans. "Papa can bring a bed frame from the barn. We have got some good blankets Mama made." Maggie tugged on her sister's sleeve. "Laya, maybe she is tired. We are talking her ear off." Laya grinned, a little embarrassed. "Sorry, I get carried away." A cold place deep inside Evelyn started to feel a little warmer. "It is all right," she said. "It is good." The girls left, promising to bring back bedding. For the first time since that woman grabbed her, Evelyn was finally alone. The quiet in the small house was peaceful, not threatening. It was the sound of a real home. She walked to the window and looked out over the endless land. The creek was a green ribbon cutting through the brown grass, all under an impossibly big Texas sky. Out there somewhere was the town that had cast her out, the life that was gone forever. But in this little room, she had been offered a place to sleep and a chance to work. These children had accepted her without knowing a thing about her past. Hope had become a dangerous thing for Evelyn. Believing things could get better only led to more pain. But standing there, feeling the sun on her face and smelling supper cooking, she felt a tiny spark. She could hear Thomas moving in the main room and the girls arguing softly about blankets. They were the sounds of a family, something so normal it felt foreign. Waking up was a shock. Sunlight poured through the window, and for a moment, the feel of a soft mattress and heavy blankets made no sense. Panic seized her. Where was she? Then she remembered. The street, the fight, Thomas Reed's quiet offer, and his two little girls. She sat up, her body protesting with a dozen different aches. Her feet throbbed and her scalp was tender, but she felt clean. She was wearing a nightgown that smelled faintly of lavender. These small comforts felt like a trap, something that could make her forget how to be tough. Voices drifted from the other room, along with the clatter of pots and pans. She stood up, testing her bandaged feet. The pain was there, but she could manage. Her dress from yesterday was folded on a chair, washed but still damp and torn. It was all she had. She put it on and tried to smooth her tangled hair. When she opened the door, the cabin was bright and clear in the morning light. The simple furniture was sturdy and the floor was swept clean. Thomas was at the stove frying bacon in a skillet. The girls were at the table. Maggie was drawing on a slate and Leah was reading a book, her lips moving with the words. Thomas looked up when he saw her. "Morning? Coffee is on." Evelyn stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. Every place she had stayed for the past 3 years had unspoken rules, lines you did not cross. "I do not want to be in the way of your breakfast," she said. "We already set a place for you," Thomas replied, nodding to the table. A fourth plate and cup were waiting. The girls cleared their things as Thomas brought the food over. He gave her a generous helping, more food than she had seen in one place for weeks. She just stared at her plate, her throat tight. "Something wrong?" Thomas asked. "Seat." Evelyn could barely bring herself to speak. She felt ashamed of her own desperate hunger. "It is a lot, but you eat what you can," Thomas said plainly. "What is left over will go to the chickens." The girls were already digging in. Maggie took her sweet time spreading jam on a biscuit, and Leah was eating bacon like a wolf. Their comfort only made Evelyn feel more out of place. Thomas poured her some coffee, strong and black. He nodded toward the sugar bowl. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug. This was real coffee, not the bitter chicory water she was used to. She took a sip and felt a knot in her chest finally loosen. "Pa makes a fine cup of coffee," Maggie said through a mouthful. "Mama taught him how." Leah jabbed her sister in the ribs. Maggie's eyes went wide, realizing her mistake. The air in the room grew heavy. "She surely did," Thomas said, his voice steady. "Your mama had a gift in the kitchen." Evelyn stared at her plate, not wanting to look up and intrude on their private grief. She took a small piece of biscuit and forced herself to swallow it past the lump in her throat. "Now," Thomas said, changing the subject, "we need to talk about you staying here." Evelyn's appetite disappeared completely. She knew this was coming, the price for his kindness. "I told you there is work," he went on. "The garden needs tendin', the chickens need feedin', and the house needs keepin'. Simple chores." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes on her. "In return, you get a roof over your head and food on the table. A fair trade." "That is all?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. "Just the housework?" A hint of a smile touched Thomas's face. "What else would there be?" Heat crept up Evelyn's neck. She had learned the hard way that men often demanded more from a woman with nowhere to turn. His genuine confusion made her feel both safe and foolish. "Nothing," she said quietly. "That is more than fair." "Good. It is settled then." Thomas went back to his breakfast. The girls will show you where everything is after we finish. I have got fence to mend out on the north pasture. I will not be back till late afternoon. If you need something, you ask them. Leia sat up a little straighter, taking her new job seriously. We will give her the grand tour, Pa. Just do not run her ragged, Thomas said. She is still mending. We will be gentle, Maggie promised. They ate the rest of their meal in a comfortable quiet. Evelyn made herself finish a biscuit and some bacon, not wanting to seem ungrateful. When they were done, Thomas stood up and grabbed his hat. Sun is burning daylight. Y'all mind your manners. Yes, Pa, they said together. He left without another word. Through the window, Evelyn watched him walk toward the barn with a long, steady stride. He was a man who knew what needed doing. He is always like that, Leia said, noticing her watching. Does not waste words. Mama used to say he thinks in whole paragraphs but only speaks in short sentences, Maggie added, then looked sad again. I am sorry. I did not mean to bring her up. Leia's face softened. It is all right. We can talk about Mama. Evelyn started gathering plates, needing to keep her hands busy. How long has it been? 2 years, Leia said. The fever took her in the winter. The doctor could not save her. She said it simply, the way a child does before they learn to hide their hurt. I'm so sorry. The words felt small, but she meant them. She understood loss all too well. Pa says she would want us to remember the good things, Maggie said, like her biscuits and her singing. That sounds like a good way to remember, Evelyn said softly. Come on, Leia said, clearing the table. Let us show you around. The tour started in the kitchen, then moved through the small cabin. Maggie proudly pointed out the pantry shelves full of canned vegetables and sacks of flour. We did most of the canning ourselves, Leia said. Pa says we are getting good at it. They showed her everything, from the cleaning rags to the water pump outside. The girls knew how to run the place. In the garden, Leia pointed out the neat rows. The tomatoes are coming in strong, and the beans need picking every other day. Evelyn knelt and touched a bean leaf. It felt familiar, a connection to a life she thought she had lost forever. She had worked her own garden once, a lifetime ago. You know your way around a garden, Maggie said, watching her. I used to have one, Evelyn said. What happened to it? The girl's question was honest, not judging. I lost our farm after my husband passed on, she said simply. I could not pay the bills. That is awful sad, Maggie said. It was, Evelyn agreed. But gardens can always be planted again. That is the good thing about the earth. It does not hold a grudge. Do you all go into town much? Evelyn asked as they walked back. Leia shook her head. Pa goes for supplies. We mostly stay here. He teaches us reading and numbers. You do not go to school? We used to, Maggie said quietly. But after Mama passed, some of the other folks did not want us around. They said we might bring sickness with us. Evelyn's fists tightened. She knew that kind of cruel fear, how people treated grief like it was a disease you could catch. That must have been hard. It was, Leia said. But Pa told us that people are just scared of what they do not understand. He said it was not about us. It was about them. Your father is a very wise man. He is the best Pa in the whole world, Maggie said, and she believed it with all her heart. Evelyn looked at the little cabin. It was more than just a house. It was a home, built by people who had faced down sorrow and kept going, a refuge they had made for themselves when the world pushed them away. Can I ask you something? Leia asked carefully. Of course you can. Why did that lady pull your hair yesterday? What did you do to make her so mad? Evelyn knew she had to tell them the truth. Children understood honesty better than most grown-ups. I took some old bread from the bakery, she said, the bread they were about to throw out. But I did not ask for it first, so to them it was stealing. Were you hungry? Maggie asked, her eyes wide. Yes, I was very hungry. Well then, Leah said with absolute certainty, that should not count as stealing at all. It is not stealing, Leah said with certainty. If someone throws something away and you need it, that should be allowed. A lot of folks do not see it that way, Evelyn told her. A lot of folks are stupid, Leah blurted out, then covered her mouth. Sorry, Papa says I should not call people stupid. Your papa is right, Evelyn said, though she did not really believe it. The day passed with Evelyn doing honest work. She gathered warm eggs from the hens and picked green beans from the garden. The chores felt like a distant memory coming back to her. The girls stayed nearby, offering a hand now and then, but mostly letting her be. Late in the afternoon, she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She looked up from her weeding to see Thomas riding in on a handsome bay horse, with tools strapped to the saddle. He swung down by the barn, unsaddling the horse with a practiced ease. Maggie hollered, "Pa's back!" and ran right for him. Evelyn watched as Thomas gave his daughter a quick hug before sending her off to get water for the horse. Leah came out too, giving a full report of the day's chores like it was vital news. Thomas just nodded while he worked, his own words too low for Evelyn to catch. Once the horse was cared for, he headed for the cabin. It was then Evelyn realized she was just standing in the garden, dirt on her hands, watching them like a stray dog watches a family through a window. "How'd it go today?" Thomas asked, stopping by the garden fence. "Good," she replied, pointing to her basket. "We've got plenty of beans for supper, with some left to put up." He looked from the beans to the tidy rose bush, then to her. "You know your way around a garden?" "I used to," she said, wiping her hands on her dress. "It's coming back to me." The girls were good helpers, real patient. A hint of pride touched Thomas's face. "They had to grow up fast, but they're good kids." "They sure are," Evelyn agreed. A thick silence fell between them. Evelyn suddenly felt a fool in her torn dress, with her messy hair and a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was a charity case, useful for now, but nothing more. "Stew's on the stove," she said, just to say something. "It'll be ready in about an hour." Thomas gave a short nod. "I'll get washed up. Girls need to do their evening chores." He walked past her, and she went back to pulling weeds, her mind racing. One day down. How many more would there be? What would happen when he got tired of having a strange widow around? She had learned long ago not to hope for anything permanent. But here, with good soil under her knees and the sounds of a family nearby, a little bit of hope started to sprout anyway. She found herself wishing that maybe just this once, things could be different. Supper was a quiet affair. The stew went over well. Maggie said it was the best she'd ever had, which Evelyn knew was just the girl being sweet. Thomas ate without a word until he was done, then gave a simple, "That was good," which felt like the highest praise. Later, while Evelyn was washing up, Thomas came out of his room holding a bundle of fabric. It was a dress, a simple one made of dark blue calico, but it was sturdy and clean. "This was my wife's," he said, laying it on the table. "It might not fit perfect, but it's better than what you've got on. The girls and I decided we'd like you to have it." Evelyn just stared at the dress, speechless. Behind him, Leah and Maggie stood watching her, their faces serious. "We wanted you to have something nice," Maggie whispered. "Something that's all yours." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She reached out a hand and touched the soft cotton. This was a gift she had no right to, a kindness that felt heavier than gold. "I can't," she choked out. "It's too much." "It's just sitting in a trunk," Thomas said plainly. "Sarah, she never liked waste." "We all wanted you to have it," Leah added, her voice firm. Evelyn looked at their faces one by one. The man with his steady gaze and his two daughters, one fierce and one with a wide-open heart. They weren't just giving her a dress. They were telling her she was worth something. They were giving her a place. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the dress to her chest. Later that night, she hung the blue dress on a nail in her small room and just looked at it. The moonlight made the fabric shine like silver. A deep quiet settled over the house. Evelyn slipped into bed, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she let herself cry. Not angry, bitter tears, but tears of relief and a fragile, blooming hope. She was still a woman with nothing to her name. Tomorrow the town could turn on her again. But tonight, she had a roof over her head, a full belly, and a blue dress that hung in the moonlight like a promise. And for now, that was more than enough. The next morning was a little easier, and the one after that easier still. Within a week, Evelyn had settled into a rhythm. She rose with the sun, got the fire going, and had coffee on by the time the others were stirring. The blue dress, after a few adjustments, fit well enough. Wearing clean, whole clothes made her feel like a different person. The work was hard, but honest. A garden doesn't pass judgment, and a stove doesn't care who lights it. She started remembering old skills, like how to make soap last, and how to stretch one chicken into 3 meals. Thomas remained polite but distant, exactly as he'd promised. He treated her like a hired hand. He'd leave early to tend his cattle or fix a fence and come home tired. He ate what she cooked, spoke a few words to his daughters, and then went to his room. It was a straightforward arrangement, but the girls were another story entirely. Leah and Maggie stuck to her side, their youthful energy a constant, welcome presence. The children took to Evelyn right away. They'd follow her around the little cabin, full of questions and eager to help with chores. They talked about everything, from the neighbor's grumpy dog to what the moon was made of. One afternoon, Maggie asked, "Miss Evelyn, do you reckon the stars are just little holes poked in the sky so heaven can peek through?" Evelyn smiled. "Well, I hear they're balls of fire a long way off, but I surely like your idea better." Leah chimed in. "Pa says they're suns, just too far to warm us, but he says it's all right to just think they're pretty." "Your pa has a lot of good sense," Evelyn said. The girls looked at each other with a knowing glance. "He can be stubborn, though," Leah said. "Especially when folks from town, like Pastor Michaels, come out here telling us we need to get back to church." Evelyn stopped her work. "The pastor used to come visiting?" "He did, for a while after Mama passed," Maggie explained. "He'd tell Pa we needed spiritual guidance, and Pa's jaw would get all tight." "What did your father say to him?" Evelyn asked. "He'd listen, polite as you please," Leah said. "Then he'd just say, 'Thank you for your concern, Pastor. We're managing just fine on our own.'" The pastor would always leave looking like he'd bitten into a lemon. Evelyn thought about Thomas Reed, a man turning his back on the church, which was the heart of most folks' lives out on the frontier. "Did something happen between your family and the church?" she asked gently. Leah's face grew serious. "After Mama died, some church ladies came by. They talked about Christian charity, but really they wanted to tell Pa he couldn't raise us right by himself. Mrs. Henderson even said he should send us to live with her. She said it wasn't fitting for girls to grow up without a mother," Maggie added quietly. A hot anger rose in Evelyn's chest. She knew Mrs. Henderson, a woman who seemed to think piety was measured by how stiff her collars were. "And what did your pa do?" "He thanked her for her concern," Leah said, a hint of pride in her voice. "Then he told her his daughters would be raised in their own home, and if she didn't find that fitting, she was welcome to keep her standards to herself." "He said it real firm but not mean," Maggie clarified. "After that, the church ladies stopped visiting, and we didn't go to town so much," Leah finished. Evelyn understood that kind of withdrawal, pulling away from a world that judged you unfairly. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Going to town and seeing other children?" Maggie thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But it's quiet here, and nobody is telling us we're wrong all the time. Plus, we have you now," Leah added, looking at Evelyn like she was a permanent fixture. That simple statement of belonging made Evelyn's throat feel tight. In just a couple of weeks, these girls had claimed her as their own. All she could do was try to be worthy of their trust. The afternoon passed in a comfortable quiet, with just the sounds of the creek and shelling peas. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt a sense of peace. But she had learned that peace never lasts. The trouble arrived on a Saturday, 3 weeks after she got there. Thomas had taken the wagon to town for supplies. The girls were at the kitchen table with their lessons, while Evelyn kneaded bread dough. Suddenly she heard the sound of several horses approaching fast. Evelyn's stomach turned to ice. She looked out the window and saw 4 men she recognized from town. Wiping the flour from her hands, she stepped onto the porch to meet them. The man in the lead was Douglas Crenshaw, who owned the general store. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice a little too friendly. "Didn't figure on finding you out here." Evelyn kept her face calm. "Mr. Crenshaw, is there something I can help you with?" "We're looking for Thomas Reed. We have some business with him." "He's in town," she said. "He won't be back until this afternoon." Douglas Crenshaw's eyes narrowed. "In town, you say? How convenient. Is there a message I can give him?" He let out a laugh that had no warmth in it. "Oh, no, ma'am. Well now, Thomas Reed taking in charity cases. I never thought I would live to see the day." The insult stung Evelyn like a slap, but her face remained a calm mask. "Is there something else you need?" "My wife mentioned you were staying out here," Douglas said, ignoring her question. "Playing house with Reed and his 2 daughters. The town is buzzing. People will always find something to buzz about," Evelyn replied softly. "They do when you give them a good reason." Douglas shifted, his saddle leather groaning. "Thomas Reed is a widower with 2 little girls. You are a woman whose reputation is already gone. A man does not need much imagination to understand that arrangement." The ugly suggestion filled the air between them. Evelyn's hands tightened into fists at her sides, but she willed herself to stay still. Showing anger would only feed the nasty stories they were telling. "I work here," she said with clarity. "I manage the house and the garden. In return, I get a room and meals." "That is the entire arrangement. Is that what you are calling it?" Henry Morrison chimed in, a nasty grin on his face. "Housework." The other men chuckled. Shame burned in Evelyn's chest, though she had done nothing to be ashamed of. This was how it always was. An accusation was heavier than the truth, and to defend yourself was to look guilty. Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Leah and Maggie stepped onto the porch, their little faces filled with fear and confusion. "Miss Evelyn?" Maggie's voice was a tiny whisper. "What is happening?" "Nothing is wrong, sweet girl," Evelyn said, her voice a steady anchor. "These men were just about to leave." "Not just yet," Douglas said, his gaze fixed on the girls. "Does your father know what kind of woman is under his roof? The kind who steals and tells lies. Our Pa knows exactly who Miss Evelyn is," Leah said, her voice sharp as a tack. "And she is not a thief or a liar. You take that back." "Leah," Evelyn said gently, "please go inside." "No." Leah's small frame was stiff with anger. "They are being cruel, and they are wrong. I will not go inside." Douglas's face hardened. "Girl, you should learn to show some respect. Your mother would be ashamed to see you defending this kind of trash. Do not you dare talk about our mama." Maggie's voice broke as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You have no right to say what she would think. You did not even come to her funeral." The words landed with a heavy thud. Douglas's face turned a deep shade of red. "Your mother died because she married a stubborn fool," he said, his words slow and cruel. "A man who thought he could survive out here alone. And now that fool shames her memory by keeping a woman like this in the same house as his children." Evelyn moved without thinking, placing herself in front of the girls like a shield. "That is enough. You have said what you came to say. Now leave this place." "Or what?" Douglas sneered, leaning over his saddle. "You will make us leave? You are nothing, Evelyn Hale. And before long, Thomas Reed will realize it and throw you out like everyone else." The words were a sharp pain, echoing her own darkest fears. But as she looked at the smug cruelty on Douglas Crenshaw's face, something stronger than fear rose up inside her. "Maybe he will," she said in a quiet voice. "But that will be his choice, not yours. Now get off this property before I go inside, and get his rifle." She had no idea if Thomas even owned a rifle, but the bluff was enough. Douglas pulled back, his expression souring. "This is not over," he spat. "The people in this community need to know what is happening out here." "Then go and tell them," Evelyn said. "Tell anyone who will listen, but do it far away from here." Douglas yanked his horse's reins, and the animal protested. The other men turned to follow, riding off in a cloud of dust and angry muttering. Evelyn watched them go, her heart pounding. When they were gone from sight, her strength left her, and she sank onto the porch steps, trembling. Leah and Maggie were right there, pressing against her on each side. "They are terrible men," Leah said with fury. "Everything they said was a lie." "I know, honey. Are you crying?" Maggie asked, looking closely at Evelyn's face. "A little bit. It was the truth. Sometimes mean words hurt, even when you know they are not true." "Pa says people are meanest when they are afraid," Maggie offered. "What are they afraid of?" Evelyn hugged the girls tight. "I do not know. Maybe they are afraid of things that are different from what they expect. Maybe they are scared when people make choices they do not understand." "That is just stupid," Leah announced. "It is," Evelyn agreed. "But that does not make their fear any less real." They sat there together, three females in a world that was not always kind to women on their own. "Miss Evelyn," Maggie's voice was very small, "are you going to leave us?" "I do not know," Evelyn answered honestly. "That might not be my decision to make. Your pa might decide I am too much trouble. He might think those men were right about the gossip I will cause." "Pa does not care about gossip," Leah said with total confidence. "He cares about what is right, and he knows you work hard and are kind to us, and you make very good biscuits." Evelyn could not help but smile. "I do make good biscuits." "The very best," Maggie agreed. "Better than the ones that win prizes at the county fair." They sat on the porch a while longer before chores called them back inside. Evelyn went to check on her bread dough, her world feeling a little more steady. The girls went back to their schoolwork, but they kept glancing over, making sure she was still there. Thomas came home just before supper, his face etched with the weariness of a long day in town. He started unloading supplies without a word. After the girls went out to feed the chickens, Evelyn told him everything. She reported the facts calmly, but she saw the muscles in his jaw tighten as she spoke of Douglas's words. "What did he say about Sarah?" Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. "He said she died because you were too stubborn to accept help from the community." Thomas carefully set down a heavy sack of flour. "And what did you say to that?" "I told him to leave. Was that before or after my daughters defended you? They were very brave girls." Thomas was silent for a long time. "I am sorry," he said at last. "I knew there would be talk. I just did not think anyone would ride out here to say such things to your face. It is not your fault what other people decide to think." "Is it not?" he said, turning to her with tired eyes. "I am the one who brought you here. I put you in this situation. You offered me work and a safe place when I had nothing," she said, meeting his gaze. "I am not sorry I came here." "This will make your life harder," Thomas warned. "People in town will stare and whisper. They will treat you exactly like the woman Douglas accused you of being." "They already treated me that way," Evelyn said quietly. "At least here I have a warm bed, food to eat, and two children who believe I am a good person." Thomas looked at her, a new understanding in his eyes. "So you plan to stay? Even knowing what it will mean?" Evelyn thought of the girl's fierce loyalty and the simple peace she had found in this small cabin. "If you will have me," she said, "I would very much like to stay." The next morning at breakfast, Thomas made an announcement. "We are all going to church this Sunday." The girls were stunned. "Church?" Leah almost dropped her fork. "We have not gone to church in over a year." "It is time we went back," Thomas said. "Why?" Maggie asked. "Because people are telling stories that are not true," he explained. "If we hide here, we are letting them control the story." He looked directly at Evelyn. "You will come with us." It sounded like an order, but Evelyn knew it was a choice. It would have been easier to stay behind and avoid the stares. "All right," she said. "I will come." Sunday morning was hot and bright. Evelyn wore her one good blue dress. The girls had on their best dresses, their faces scrubbed clean. Thomas put on a clean shirt, and together the new family prepared to face the town, his good Sunday vest, the one his late wife Sarah had stitched for him. The ride into town was silent. Everyone knew what they were heading into. Evelyn sat with the girls in the wagon bed as the familiar country rolled by. When they arrived at the church, folks were already gathered outside. All conversation stopped as Thomas pulled the wagon to a halt. Heads turned, and whispers started like wind through dry grass. Thomas got down, helped his daughters, and then turned and offered his hand to Evelyn. She took it. His grip was strong and steady as she stepped into the dusty churchyard, surrounded by people who thought they knew her story. Margaret Crenshaw, Douglas's wife, stood near the steps, her face a mask of disapproval. Pastor Michaels came out of the church, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. Thomas kept a firm hold on Evelyn's hand as they walked forward. Leah and Maggie walked beside them like a little honor guard, their chins held high. The crowd parted for them, creating an aisle that felt more like a challenge than a welcome. "Thomas," the pastor said, "good to see you and your daughters." And his eyes landed on Evelyn, and he paused. "This is Mrs. Hale," Thomas said plainly. "She's working for us. I figured she deserved a Sunday off, same as anyone else." The pastor's eyebrows lifted just a bit. "Of course. All are welcome in the house of the Lord." "I'm glad to hear it," Thomas replied, and led his family straight inside. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust to the dim light. Thomas led them to a pew about 3 rows from the front. They weren't hiding in the back, but they weren't making a show up front either. They were just sitting where a family belongs. The church filled up around them with people choosing their seats very carefully, some close, some pointedly far away. Evelyn stared straight ahead, feeling the weight of all those eyes on her back. Pastor Michaels began his sermon. It was about not judging other people. Evelyn wondered if he had chosen it for them, or if it was just a coincidence. She tried to listen, but her mind was on the whispers behind her. Beside her, Maggie reached out and squeezed her hand, a small, fierce gesture of protection. Leah sat straight as a board, daring anyone to look at them wrong. And Thomas just watched the pulpit with a steady gaze, as if to say he had every right to be there with his family. His family. The thought surprised Evelyn. She was becoming one of them. When the service was over, Thomas did not rush to leave. He let the other people file out, meeting the eyes of those who would look at him, and ignoring those who would not. When their pew was clear, he stood. They had only made it halfway down the aisle when Margaret Crenshaw stepped right in their way, blocking their path. "A word, Thomas," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If you have a moment." Thomas stopped and looked at her calmly. "Mrs. Crenshaw." Her eyes shot over to Evelyn, full of disgust. "I wanted to speak with you about your situation. I'm just a concerned neighbor who knew your poor departed wife." "My business is my own," Thomas cut in, his voice low. "And Sarah's memory doesn't need your protection." Margaret's face turned red. "I'm only trying to help. Surely you see how this looks, having this woman under your roof." "That woman's name is Miss Evelyn," Leah said, her voice ringing out. "And she's kind, and she takes good care of us." "Leah, hush," Margaret snapped. "This is grown-up business." "I understand just fine," Leah shot back. "I understand you're being mean." "Leah," Thomas said, his voice quiet but firm. "That's enough." Leah went quiet, but she still looked angry. Thomas turned his calm gaze on Margaret. "Mrs. Crenshaw, I thank you for your concern, but you're mistaken. Miss Hale works for me. She runs my house and helps with my girls. It's a proper arrangement. If it bothers you, I suggest you look at your own thoughts instead of my choices." "But the way it looks," Margaret started again. "It looks exactly like what it is," Thomas said. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we've got chores to do." He stepped forward, leaving Margaret no choice but to move out of his way. The girls hurried after him, with Evelyn right behind, feeling the woman's nasty glare on her back. The bright sun outside felt like a relief. Thomas helped them all into the wagon without a word, then took up the reins. As they rode away, Evelyn saw folks staring, their faces full of judgment and curiosity. They were a good ways out of town when Maggie finally spoke. "That was scary." "It was," Thomas agreed. "But we did it," Leah said, sounding proud. "We went, we stayed, and we didn't let 'em shame us." "No, we didn't," Thomas said. "I'm proud of you both." "Of Miss Evelyn, too?" Maggie asked. Thomas looked back at Evelyn, his face hard to read. "Miss Evelyn, too. She showed true grit today." Evelyn looked down at her hands resting on the blue fabric of Sarah's dress. She had survived worse than the town's gossip. She had survived being cold and hungry and alone. But this, standing up and claiming her place when everyone wanted her to disappear, this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something new. That fragile hope lasted for exactly 4 days. On a hot Thursday afternoon, Evelyn was on her knees in the garden, pulling weeds. She heard a horse coming up the path, moving way too fast for a friendly visit. She stood up, shielding her eyes from the sun. Her stomach sank when she saw who it was. Daniel's brother, Jacob Hale, hadn't changed a bit in 3 years. He was still lean with hard eyes, and he carried himself like a man who always got his way. He pulled his horse up so hard it sidestepped, then he swung down from the saddle with a showy move, as if he were playing to a crowd. Evelyn stood her ground right there in the garden, dirt on her hands, refusing to let him see her tremble. "Evelyn," he said, his voice slick with fake friendliness. "It has been a long time." "Not long enough," she answered, her voice low. Jacob's smile tightened. "Is that any way to greet your family?" "You stopped being family when you took our farm." "Took?" He raised his eyebrows in pretend surprise. "That is a strong word. I paid the debts on the place. It is not my fault Daniel left you in such a terrible mess." Evelyn's hands squeezed the weed she was holding. This was an old fight, a wound that had never healed right. After Daniel died, Jacob had shown up with a stack of legal papers and a sympathetic look. He offered to help by taking on the farm's debts. She was too lost in her grief to understand the papers she signed. By the time she did, it was too late. He had tricked her out of everything, making it look like an act of kindness. "What do you want, Jacob?" "Heard you landed on your feet," he said, his eyes scanning past her toward the small cabin. "Or on your back, depending on the story." The insult was smooth and practiced. Evelyn felt a hot blush creep up her neck, but she kept her voice steady. "I work here. That is all." "Sure you do," Jacob said, stepping closer. Evelyn had to fight the urge to step away from him. "The thing is, folks are talking, and some of that talk is getting back to people who knew Daniel. People who knew you when you had a good name. It makes me look bad, having my brother's widow living in sin out here. I am not living in sin. And what people think is their business, not yours." "See, that is where you are wrong," Jacob said, his expression turning hard. "You are still a Hale, whether you like it or not. What you do reflects on our family name. And right now, you are making us look like trash." Just then, the cabin door creaked open behind her. Evelyn did not turn, but she felt the shift in Jacob's focus. "Can I help you with something?" Thomas's voice was calm, but there was a core of steel in it. Jacob's smile came back, but it was sharper this time. "You must be Reed. I am Jacob Hale, Evelyn's brother-in-law." Thomas came to stand right next to Evelyn. He did not touch her, but his closeness was a clear statement. "I know who you are." "Then you know I have a right to be concerned about my sister-in-law's well-being. I have been hearing things, so I came to see for myself that this whole situation is proper." "Everything is proper," Thomas said, his voice flat. "Is it?" Jacob looked from Thomas to Evelyn, his eyes lingering on the dress she wore. "A woman living alone with a widower and his girls. People are going to wonder about this arrangement." "People can wonder all they want," Thomas replied. "It does not change the facts." "Facts," Jacob drew the word out. Fact is, Evelyn has no reputation left. Fact is, she is living on your charity. Fact is, soon enough you will get tired of the burden and show her the door. And when that happens, she will come crawling back to her family. I would die first, Evelyn whispered, the words tumbling out. Jacob's face went cold. Be careful, Evelyn. You do not have many choices left. I am offering you a dignified way out of this. What are you offering? Thomas asked, his voice low. A simple solution, Jacob said. Evelyn comes back to my house to work. My household needs a manager, and she knows the work. She will have room and board, a respectable job, and an end to all this ugly talk. He looked straight at Evelyn. It is a fair offer. Evelyn felt a wave of sickness. She knew exactly what his offer meant. It meant being his unpaid servant, trapped in his house where he could control her every move. There would be no escape. Who would believe a poor widow over a wealthy landowner? No, she said. The word was quiet but firm. No. You are saying no to your family, to a respectable life? Jacob's voice began to rise. I am saying no to you, Evelyn said, her own voice shaking but clear. I would rather stay here and face the gossip than spend a single day under your roof. Jacob's face turned a dark shade of red. You ungrateful girl. After all I did for you. You stole our farm, Evelyn cut in, her anger finally boiling over. You took everything Daniel and I built, and you had the nerve to call it help. You did not save me, Jacob. You stripped me of everything I had. I paid legal debts, Jacob snapped. That land was collateral. If Daniel had been a better manager... Daniel was sick, Evelyn cried. He was dying, and he was doing everything he could to hold on. You just waited for him to be in the ground before you showed up with your lawyers and your lies. The words poured out of her, 3 years of pain and anger finally finding a voice. Thomas stood beside her, solid as a rock. His presence gave her strength. Jacob lunged toward her, his hand raised. But Thomas moved faster than she had ever seen. In a flash, he was between them, his hand locked around Jacob's wrist. The grip made the other man flinch. You touch her, and we will have a serious problem, Thomas said, his voice dangerously low. Jacob tore his arm away, rubbing his wrist. Are you threatening me? Just stating facts, Thomas said calmly. Mrs. Hale has made her choice. She works for me now, and she lives under my protection. And you are on my property without an invitation. I suggest you leave. This is not over, Jacob seethed. You think you can play house with my brother's widow and there will be no consequences? I will make sure the whole county knows what is going on here. I will have the law look into this. The law is welcome any time, Thomas said. I have nothing to hide. Jacob spat in the dirt near Thomas's feet. You are making a big mistake, Reed. He turned his glare on Evelyn. And you will live to regret this. He swung himself onto his horse and galloped away, leaving them in a cloud of dust. Evelyn stood there, shaking from the confrontation. She had stood up to him. She had told the truth, and she was still standing. Are you all right? Thomas asked gently. Evelyn could only nod, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. Thomas led her to the porch steps and sat with her in the quiet aftermath. He guided her to a seat and brought her a cup of water. He sat nearby, a quiet presence. Drink this, he said gently. The cool water helped calm her shaking hands. He took the farm, she finally said, her voice thin. After my Daniel passed, I fell behind on the payments. Jacob offered to help. He said he would handle the debts if I just signed some papers. She looked down at her hands. I was so tired, so heartbroken. I did not read them right. I signed it all away to him, and by the time I knew, it was too late. That is how you ended up on the street, Thomas stated quietly. It was not a question. I had nowhere else to turn. Jacob was my only family, and I could not go back to him. I would not. You do not have to explain, Thomas said. I understand. They sat in the quiet of the afternoon. He will make trouble for you, Evelyn said. He meant what he said about the law. He will find a way to make you pay for this. Let him try, Thomas answered, his voice steady. I am not afraid of Jacob Hale. You should be, she insisted. He is a cruel man with money and friends in high places. Thomas looked out at the far-off mountains for a long moment. Are you thinking of leaving? He asked. To keep that trouble away from us. The unspoken offer hung in the air. She could leave and take the scandal with her. It would be the noble thing to do, protecting this small family from her past. I do not want to go, she whispered. Then do not, he said, his voice firm. We will face whatever comes, together. But the girls need to see someone fight for what is right, Thomas cut in. They need to learn that you do not back down from a bully just because he makes threats. I will not teach my daughters to run from a fight or sacrifice good people to keep bad ones happy. Evelyn truly saw him then, and it was not just charity in his eyes. It was a choice. He had decided she was worth defending. I will not let you regret this, she promised. I know you will not, Thomas said with a small smile. Now, let us go inside. I reckon those girls have their ears pressed to the window. He was right. When they entered, Leah and Maggie were trying their best to look innocent near the window. That man was mean, Maggie declared. He surely was, Thomas agreed. Is he really your family, Miss Evelyn? Leah asked. By marriage, Evelyn explained, but that does not count for much without kindness. Are you going to leave? Maggie asked, her voice tiny. Evelyn knelt down to look the child in the eye. No, sweetheart, I am not leaving. Promise? Maggie's eyes were wide and hopeful. Evelyn hesitated for just a second. She knew how easily promises could be broken. But looking at those two worried faces with Thomas standing strong behind them, she found the words, I promise. I am staying. Maggie hugged her neck tightly and Leah quickly joined in. Later that night, the quiet of the cabin felt different. The fight with Jacob had broken down her final wall of defense. She had stood up for herself. She had refused to be shamed. She had promised two little girls that she would not abandon them. And through it all, Thomas had been right there beside her. She finally admitted to herself that she was no longer just working here. She was building a home. The thought was terrifying because a home was something you could lose. It meant she cared for this quiet man and his daughters, and that caring would hurt when it ended. A soft knock came at her door. It is me, Thomas said from the other side. May I come in? He stood there holding a lantern, his face serious in the flickering light. I could not sleep, he said. I figured you might be awake too. Yes, she admitted. My mind is racing. Thomas nodded. What Jacob said about people talking about the law. He is not wrong. This arrangement we have, it leaves you open to gossip and trouble. Her heart sank. This was it. He had realized she was more trouble than she was worth. I understand if you need me to. What I need, Thomas interrupted gently, is to make sure you are properly protected. I want to stop any ugly talk before it starts. He took a deep breath. Evelyn, I am asking if you would consider marrying me. It would be on paper, a legal marriage to give you a place here that no one can question. She stared at him, stunned. It would be for practical reasons, he said quickly. Nothing would have to change between us. But in the eyes of the town, you would be my wife. The girls would have a mother. No one could ever threaten you again. That is too much to ask, she finally managed. You cannot tie yourself to me to stop gossip. I can do what I think is right, he said simply. And this feels right. The girls need you. I need your help, and you deserve to be safe. What about you? Evelyn asked. What about finding someone you want to marry for love? I married for love once, Thomas said, his voice soft with memory. Sarah was my everything. I do not expect to find that again. But I can offer you a partnership built on respect and protection. I think that is a fine thing to build a life on. A marriage on paper. A real family. It was a sensible solution, but it was also a tremendous leap of faith. I need to think, she said. Of course, he replied. Take all the time you need. He left her with the lantern light and her spinning thoughts. A marriage to Thomas Reed was a safe harbor in a storm she had been weathering for too long. He was a good, steady man who had shown her nothing but kindness. He was offering her a home. She knew the whispers in town were only going to get louder. Evelyn thought about her promise to Leah and Maggie and how easily talk could force her to break it. Then she thought of Thomas, standing up for her to Jacob. She remembered him saying, "We'll handle whatever comes," like it was the simplest thing in the world. He had offered marriage not out of romance, but out of simple decency. He saw a problem and knew how to fix it. By sunrise, her mind was made up. She found him in the barn, already at his chores. "I'll do it," she said before she could lose her nerve. "I'll marry you, if the offer's still open." Thomas set down his pitchfork. "It's open." "Just so we're clear," she said, needing the lines drawn. "This is a practical deal, for protection and nothing more." "It's whatever you need it to be," Thomas agreed. "We'll tell people a simple story. Pastor Michaels can marry us quiet with just the family there. The girls, they don't know I was going to ask. I wanted your answer first." Thomas studied her face for a long moment. "You sure about this?" "Once a thing is done, it's done. 3 years ago, the thought of being tied down would have scared her to death. Now it felt like the safest harbor she could imagine." "I'm sure," she told him. "Then we'll tell the girls at breakfast," Thomas said. "I'll ride to town this afternoon. Talk to the pastor about a ceremony soon as he can manage it, before Jacob or anyone else can make more trouble." They stood in the quiet barn as the morning light streamed in. It was not a romantic moment, but it was solid and real. For the first time in 3 long years, Evelyn felt like she was choosing her own future, not just surviving it. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thomas gave a single nod, always uncomfortable with thanks. "Seemed like the right thing to do." "It is," Evelyn said. "It surely is." At breakfast, Thomas cleared his throat in a way that got the girls' attention right away. "Got something to discuss," he said. "Something that affects all of us." Leah and Maggie looked at each other, worried. "I've asked Mrs. Hale to marry me," Thomas went on, "and she said yes. We'll have a small ceremony, just us. Then she'll be your stepmother, proper and legal." For a moment there was just dead silence. Then Maggie's face broke into the biggest smile Evelyn had ever seen. "Really?" she breathed. "You're going to be our mama?" "If you'll have me," Evelyn said, her throat feeling tight. In a flash, Maggie was in her lap, wrapping her arms around her neck. "Yes, yes, yes. Can I call you Mama?" Evelyn looked to Thomas, who nodded. "If you want to," Evelyn said. "If it feels right." Leah was slower, her face serious. "This is because of what that man said yesterday," she stated. "You're getting married so nobody can say mean things." "That's part of it," Thomas admitted. "But it's also because Mrs. Hale is already family in all the ways that matter. This just makes it official." Leah looked straight at Evelyn. "Do you want to marry Pa, or are you just doing it 'cause you have to?" It was a fair question, asked with a child's honesty. "I want to stay here," Evelyn said carefully. "I want to take care of you and your Pa, and getting married is the surest way to do that. So, yes, I want to." Leah seemed to accept this. "Okay, then, I think it's a good idea." There was a small pause. "Are you girls all right with this?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Maggie said, squeezing Evelyn even tighter. "We're getting a mama." "I'm all right with it," Leah said, "long as everyone's happy." "Then it's settled," Thomas said, his eyes on Evelyn. "I'll talk to the pastor today. We can probably have the ceremony this weekend." This weekend? The reality of it washed over Evelyn. In 3 days she would be a wife again, a mother to these two girls who had already stolen her heart. She was getting back everything she had lost, just in a different way. "This weekend," she repeated. "That's good." Thomas's mouth twitched into a hint of a smile. "Try not to sound too excited about it." In spite of herself, Evelyn laughed. "Sorry, it's just, this is a lot." "It is," Thomas agreed, "but we'll manage. We always do." And looking at him with Maggie clinging to her and Leah watching with cautious hope, she believed him. The next 3 days flew by in a blur. Thomas returned from town. Pastor Michaels had agreed to perform the ceremony at their cabin on Saturday. The girls threw themselves into getting ready, scrubbing the cabin until it shined and picking wildflowers to put in jars. "It has to be special," Maggie said, standing on a chair to hang flowers above the doorway. "Even if it's small, it should feel like a real wedding." Leah had found one of her mother's old books on etiquette and appointed herself the expert. "It says here the bride should wear something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue," she announced. Evelyn looked down at her faded blue dress, which had belonged to Sarah. "I reckon I'm covered on 2 of those already." "But what about new and old?" Leah pushed. Thomas, mending a harness at the table, spoke without looking up. "There's a box in my room, top shelf. Bring it here." Leah returned with a small wooden box. Thomas opened it and took out a delicate lace collar. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice quiet. "Sarah wore it at our wedding. If you want it, it covers old and borrowed." Evelyn touched the lace, her fingers trembling. "I can't. It's too precious." "It's meant to be worn," Thomas said, "and passed down." "What about new?" Maggie asked. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "I bought this in town yesterday. It's not fancy, but it's yours." Evelyn stared at the ring. She had sold her first wedding band months ago for food. She never imagined she would have the right to wear one again. "Thank you," she whispered, because the words felt too small for the moment. "Well, that's settled then," Thomas said, clearly uncomfortable. Friday evening they heard horses approaching, moving at a slow, easy pace. It was not the sound of trouble. Thomas was at the door in an instant, his expression wary. 3 riders came into view. Evelyn recognized John Patterson, their neighbor, with his wife Emma and their son. They were good, hard-working people who tended to keep to themselves. "Thomas," John called out as he dismounted. "Hope we're not intruding." "Never an intrusion," Thomas said, though he was still cautious. "What brings you out this way?" Emma Patterson climbed down, carrying a covered basket. "We heard you're getting married tomorrow," she said with a warm smile. "Thought we'd bring by a few things." "Yes," Evelyn said the next morning, her voice clear and sure. "Yes, I will marry you." The relief on Thomas's face was all the confirmation she needed. A few days later, a wagon pulled up. It was their neighbors, John and Emma, with their young son. "Heard the news," Emma said, her smile warm. "Congratulations, dear." "We brought you a few things," she continued, handing over a basket. "Some preserves, honey, and a wedding cake." John held up a bottle of whiskey. "For toasting," he said with a grin. "You did not have to do this," Thomas said, genuinely surprised. "We wanted to," John said firmly. "You are a good neighbor, Thomas. When I heard folks talking ugly, it did not sit right." "I do not know your whole story, ma'am," he said to Evelyn, "but I know Thomas Reed. He does not make foolish choices. If he is marrying you, that is good enough for us." "Mama made you this," their son said shyly, holding out a small package. Inside was a handkerchief with tiny flowers stitched into the corner. "For happy tears," Emma explained. Evelyn took the gift, her own eyes filling with them. After so much cruelty, this simple kindness felt like sunshine after a long rain. They had barely known her before, and they had surely heard the ugly rumors. But they came anyway, bringing food and kindness. They came with a clear message. Not everyone had turned against her. "Y'all should stay for supper," Thomas said suddenly. "It is the least we can do." Emma smiled, looking pleased. "We would be honored." The evening was a welcome surprise. The Pattersons filled the small cabin with easy conversation and a genuine warmth. They treated Evelyn like she was already one of them. John and Thomas talked about cattle prices. Emma helped Evelyn in the kitchen, chatting about her own wedding day from years ago. "The real secret to a good marriage," Emma said softly as they set the table, "is to always remember you are on the same team. Even when you disagree, you are partners." It sounds simple, but it is easy to forget when life gets tough. "This arrangement," Evelyn said quietly, "is not exactly normal." Emma gave her a knowing smile. "Honey, when you get right down to it, most of the good ones are not. People make all sorts of arrangements for land, for safety, or just for company. What truly matters is if you are good to each other. You treat each other with respect and you work toward the same things. From what I can tell, you and Thomas are doing just fine." After the Pattersons left, the cabin felt a little warmer. Thomas stood on the porch, watching their lantern fade down the road. "Well, I didn't expect that," he said when Evelyn joined him. "Me neither." "Goes to show there are good folks mixed in with the bad," Thomas said. "Just takes time to see who's who." That night, Evelyn lay in her room for the last time, wondering what tomorrow would bring. There would be vows, a ring, and legal words binding her to Thomas. And then they would keep on as they were, working together, raising the girls, building something that looked like a family, even if it did not start with romance. The thought was not as cold as it should have been. She had learned there were different kinds of love. Maybe the steady kind, built on shared purpose, was enough. Maybe it was even better. The next morning was clear and bright, a perfect late summer day. Evelyn woke early, her stomach in knots, and saw Thomas already outside. He was splitting firewood with a steady rhythm, working off his own nerves in the most practical way he knew. The girls were still asleep. Evelyn moved quietly around the cabin, making coffee and starting breakfast. The familiar work helped to steady her hands. When Thomas came inside, he stopped and looked at her. "You all right?" he asked. "A little nervous," Evelyn admitted. "You too." He poured a cup of coffee. "I reckon we should talk about how things will be after today." "All right." Thomas sat at the table. "This is a legal marriage. That means you have rights to this land and protection under my name. I want you to know this is real, not just for show." "I understand." "And about the sleep-in arrangement," Thomas went on, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I meant what I said about separate rooms. But this cabin is small. Folks will expect us to share. I can build a partition in my room. That will give us each our own space, but it might quiet the gossip." Evelyn thought about it. The idea was practical and decent, just like Thomas. "That sounds reasonable," she said. "Good." Thomas looked relieved. "And if you ever want things to be different, you just tell me. This is meant to make your life better, not harder." "It already has," Evelyn said quietly. "Just being here, having good work, and being around people who treat me like I matter." "You do matter," Thomas said. "To the girls, and to this place." He paused. "And to me." The words hung in the air between them. Before she could answer, they heard little feet pounding on the floor above. "It's today," Maggie shouted. "Layla, wake up, it's today." Thomas gave a small smile. "No turning back now." "I would not dream of it," Evelyn said, and she meant every word. It was a beautiful flurry of last-minute wedding tasks. Laya worked on Evelyn's hair, creating a simple upswept style that looked mighty fine. Maggie gathered a bouquet of wildflowers and sage, and it smelled just like the prairie. Evelyn put on the blue dress, which now fit her perfectly, and pinned the lace collar from Thomas's mother at her throat. She looked at herself in a piece of broken mirror and hardly knew the woman staring back, a woman with hope in her eyes. Leah stood in the doorway, her voice thick. "You look beautiful." Maggie squeezed in next to her, adding, "Like a real bride." Evelyn knelt and hugged them close. "Thank you both for everything." "We just had to make it official," Leah said with a fierce look. Pastor Michaels rode up right at 2 o'clock on a sturdy mare, his worn Bible tucked in a satchel. He was a lean man in his 50s with kind, patient eyes. "Thomas," he said, swinging down from his horse. "Mrs. Hale, girls." Thomas shook his hand. "Thank you for coming, Pastor." The pastor glanced at the simple cabin and the small group ready for a wedding. "Shall we begin? The simple ceremonies are often the best." They all gathered in the main room. Through the open door, Evelyn saw the land stretching out toward the mountains, vast and beautiful. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Michael started, his voice full of tradition, "we are gathered here today to join Thomas Reed and Evelyn Hale in holy matrimony." The words felt like a dream. Her first wedding was in a crowded church full of promise. This one was small and quiet, born of need. But as she looked at Thomas, whose gaze was steady on her, it felt just as real, just as important. Marriage is a serious thing, not to be taken lightly. "Thomas," the pastor went on, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Thomas said, his voice clear and strong. "Evelyn, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" This was the moment that changed her whole life. She looked at the quiet man who had given her a home and a family, asking for nothing she was not willing to give. She thought about the peace they had found together. "I do," she said, and the words felt true deep in her soul. Thomas pulled the ring from his pocket. The pastor nodded, and Thomas gently took her hand. "With this ring," he said, his voice steady, "I thee wed." The simple gold band slid onto her finger, a perfect fit against her hard-working hands. "By the power vested in me," Pastor Michaels said with a warm smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Thomas looked at her, a question in his eyes. She gave a small nod, and he leaned in for a brief, gentle kiss. It was a simple promise, honest and real. "Congratulations," the pastor said. "May your marriage be a blessed one." Maggie let out a happy shout and nearly knocked Evelyn over with a hug. "We have a mama now," she cried into Evelyn's dress. "A real official mama." "You do," Evelyn said, her voice breaking, "if you'll have me." Pastor Michael stayed for a simple meal and a slice of cake. He was kind and did not ask any awkward questions. As he left, he told Evelyn she was always welcome at church. He said to Thomas, "You've made a good choice, both of you." After he was gone, the four of them stood in the yard as the sun cast long shadows. "Well," Thomas said after a moment, "I reckon we're married now." "I suppose we are," Evelyn agreed. "Does it feel different?" Maggie asked, looking from one to the other. "Not different," Leah said wisely. "Just more settled, more right." And she was correct. Nothing had really changed, but everything felt like it had finally fallen into place. That evening, Thomas built a divider in the bedroom using spare lumber and canvas to create 2 private spaces. It was simple, but it worked. "This all right for you?" he asked. Her new space was small, but it was hers. "It's perfect, thank you." "You're my wife now," Thomas said, as if that explained it all. "Your comfort is important." That night, Evelyn lay in her new bed, listening to Thomas breathing on the other side of the partition. Being married didn't feel like a trap. It felt like solid ground, a place to finally build a life without fear. The marriage proved its worth right away. Word got around fast that Thomas Reed had married the widow Hale and made her respectable. The town gossip did not stop, but it changed from scandal to a quiet acceptance. When they went to church that next Sunday, Margaret Crenshaw looked sour, but she could not say a word against a legal marriage. A few folks offered polite congratulations. The Pattersons sat right next to them, and Emma gave Evelyn's hand a warm squeeze. "See," she whispered, "I told you it would all work out." The real test came about 3 weeks later. Evelyn was in the garden when she heard a horse. Her stomach tightened when she saw Jacob Hale riding into the yard, his face like a thundercloud. She stood up to meet him, her hands still covered in dirt. Thomas came out of the barn, tools in hand, and stood right beside her. The girls watched from the porch, ready. "Jacob," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "Heard you got hitched," he sneered. "Came to see for myself." "It's true," Thomas said flatly. "Evelyn is my wife, all legal and proper." Jacob's jaw clenched. "You actually married her? I thought you had better sense." "I've got sense enough to know a good woman when I find one," Thomas said. "Now, unless you have business here, you should be on your way." Thomas took 2 long steps toward Jacob, not threatening, but with a look so firm it made Jacob's horse step back. "You're going to leave now." "To apologize," Thomas said in a low voice. "And then you are going to get on your horse and you are not coming back. If you ever speak about my wife like that again, this conversation will go very differently." "Your wife," Jacob sneered. "A piece of paper does not make her decent." "I think she is worth 10 of you," Thomas cut in. "I think she has survived things that would have broken other people. She works harder than anyone I know, and she shows my daughters more kindness than they have seen in a long time. And I think you are a bitter man who cannot stand to see someone get away from you." The words hit Jacob hard. His face turned pale. "This is not over," he said. "Yes, it is," Thomas stated flatly. "Evelyn is my wife now. She has legal protection, a home, and a family. There is nothing you can do, no claim you can make. She is beyond your reach, and that just eats you up inside, does not it? Knowing you have no more power over her." Jacob opened his mouth, then closed it. Then he jerked his horse's head around. "You will regret this," he yelled. "I surely doubt it," Thomas replied. They watched him ride off in a cloud of dust. When Jacob was gone, Evelyn let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked. She looked at the man who had just defended her with such fierce conviction. "I am better than all right," she said. "I am free." Free from Jacob, free from fear, and free from the worry of being cast out with nowhere to go. The simple ring on her finger meant she had a place in the world, a place no one could take from her. "Thank you," she said, "for what you told him about me being worth something." "It was not a lie," Thomas said simply. "It was just the truth." That evening, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The air was cool and pleasant. "I have been thinking," Thomas said after a while. "We should probably talk about the future, what you want and what the girls need." "What do you want?" Evelyn asked him. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I want the girls to grow up safe and happy. I want them to see that a family can be built on respect, not just romance. And I want them to learn that folks deserve a second chance." Thomas paused, letting the quiet settle between them on the porch. He wanted her to feel like this was truly her home, not just a place she was passing through. Evelyn looked out at the vast Texas night and said softly, "It does, more than any place has in a long, long time." Thomas shifted in his chair. "Good, because I was thinking we might expand the garden next spring, maybe get some pigs. If we work together, we could build something real here." Evelyn caught the word he used. "We." "We are partners now, Evelyn," Thomas said, his voice steady and sure. "Legally and practically. Seems right we ought to plan and build together." He looked at her, his face serious in the dim light. "If that is what you want." What she wanted was suddenly overwhelmingly clear. She wanted this quiet partnership, this shared work, these girls who called her Mama. "Yes," she said, her voice full of a feeling she had not known in years. "That is exactly what I want." Just 6 weeks ago, she had nothing but the clothes on her back and the deep shame of being dragged through town for everyone to see. Now, she had everything that mattered. "Miss Evelyn?" A small voice called from inside the cabin, sleepy and small. "Can you tuck me in again?" Evelyn smiled and stood up. "I will be right there, sweetheart." As she went inside, Maggie was waiting, covers pulled right up to her chin. "Mama," she mumbled, her eyes already drooping. "Are you happy now?" Evelyn thought of all the complicated feelings swirling inside her, the relief, the gratitude, the bone-deep weariness of a long fight. "Yes, darling," she said simply, smoothing the blanket. "I am happy." "Good," Maggie murmured, already drifting into sleep. "You deserve to be." She returned to the porch where Thomas was still sitting, the sweet smell of his pipe smoke in the night air. "They are good girls," she said. "They are," he agreed. "Thanks to you." Evelyn hesitated for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She struggled to find the right words. "Do you reckon a marriage that starts out practical can ever turn into something more?" Thomas took a slow draw from his pipe, considering her question. "I think folks who work side by side, who respect one another, who build something worth keeping, well, that is as solid a foundation as any. Maybe more solid than just feelings that can fade." He looked over at her. "Why do you ask?" Evelyn was not sure how to explain the new warmth she had started to feel for this quiet, steady man. "Just wondering," she said softly, "about possibilities." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Possibilities are good," he said finally. "No rush on anything, but I am not against seeing where things go." "Naturally," Evelyn agreed, feeling a tightness in her chest finally ease. They sat together as the night deepened, two people brought together by circumstance who were now choosing to stay. The future stretched out ahead, uncertain, but no longer terrifying. Whatever came, they would face it together, as partners, as parents. Evelyn glanced down at the simple wedding band on her finger. It gleamed in the starlight, a promise of this new life built from broken pieces. "Getting late," Thomas said eventually, tapping out his pipe. "Should probably turn in." "Probably," Evelyn agreed, but neither of them moved just yet. "Evelyn?" His voice was quiet. "Yes?" "I am mighty glad you stayed. Glad you said yes. I just wanted you to know that." The simple words spread a warmth through her chest, chasing away any lingering shadows of doubt. "I am glad too," she said. "More than I know how to say." They went inside together. After checking on the girls one last time, Evelyn retired to her side of the partition, to a bed that felt less lonely, knowing he was just on the other side of that thin wall. She lay in the darkness, listening to the cabin settle around her, to Thomas's breathing growing even and deep. She thought about tomorrow. There would be bread to bake and eggs to collect, 100 small tasks that made up a life. There would be challenges, she knew. But tonight, in this moment, she was warm and safe. She had children who loved her, and a husband who respected her. For the first time in 3 long years, Evelyn Reed closed her eyes and slept without fear, dreaming of gardens and growing girls, and the quiet man whose presence had become her foundation. The woman who had been dragged through the dust was gone. In her place stood a woman chosen by 2 little girls who decided she was worth saving. By choosing her, they had given her back a life, a family, and the belief that she deserved her place in the world. And she would spend the rest of her days proving them right. Her story had not ended in humiliation on a dusty street. It had begun right here, in this small cabin, with the quiet truth that family is built not from blood, but from the deliberate choice to keep showing up and believing that even the most broken things can be made whole again. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.